Hello everyone, welcome to my video on challenging concepts on the endocrine system, which is chapter 16 of the Marieb textbook. So a quick overview of the difference between endocrine and exocrine. Please remember, let's not say inside, outside, that's more bio, and for A and P we need a little more information. So we're going to talk in terms of ducts versus no ducts, the destination of the secretions and what kind of secretions they could be. So exocrine use ducts and they will secrete their secretions to surface of membrane, which could be our skin or mucous membranes, for example. Well, endocrine lacks ducts and they produce hormones and they secrete it into the bloodstream. In terms of hormone types, you want to remember that there are water-soluble and lipid-soluble. Water-soluble are amino acid-based, while lipid-soluble are, as the name, as it's soluble lipids, they are generally lipid-based steroids, steroid-based. So they act differently in our cells. First of all, remind yourselves that our cell membrane is made up of phospholipids, which bulk of it is that lipid part of it, which makes it lipid soluble, so water insoluble because of the because of non-polarity of it, and hence being hydrophobic. So the lipid soluble, which we'll discuss in the next slide, can diffuse through the plasma membrane, while the water soluble cannot. Hence, the receptors for the water soluble are on the outside of the cell, facing the outside of the cell. So hormones bind to these receptors, they will start a cascade of events. It's very similar to what we had in our eye, in the rhodopsin, very similar to that, right? So here the emphasis is on the receptor with information being passed on with the G protein, adenylate cyclase, which converts ATP to cyclic AMP. And one you want to remember about cyclic AMP is that in this pathway it is considered the second messenger. Okay, and this activates a protein kinase, which in turn will cause a response in our target cell. That's what we need to be aware of for a broad way in which the water soluble hormones act. Whereas lipid soluble, the fact that it's lipid based and it's lipid soluble, it can diffuse through our plasma membrane, so their receptors are found inside the cell, so within the cytoplasm. Excuse me. So the hormone binds with the receptor and then will enter the nucleus of the cell, and then they would enhance protein synthesis. Okay, so they directly influence protein synthesis in our DNA, in our cell. Whereas the water soluble have to do it indirectly, right? And hence the action is also a little slower. Next, we're going to talk about how hormones are released. There are three ways in which hormones can be released. One is called humoral, the other one is neural, and the third one is hormonal. So humor is liquid, so anything in our liquids, for example, mainly our blood plasma, right? So any biochemical concentration changes will influence their release. A good example is calcium. If we have a low calcium in our blood, it's going to stimulate parathyroid hormones to be released, which will cause calcium to be released from the bone, which we'll talk about in this video a little bit later. The other one's the neural. This is a neuron stimulating, the one we should be aware of from our conversation with the autonomic nervous system is our sympathetic preganglionic neuron, which will cause epinephrine and norepinephrine release from the adrenal medulla. The next one is hormonal. So one hormone influences another hormone to be released or even inhibited, in fact. Um, so we'll be looking at a few. The one that's initially talked about here is TSH, that's released. So TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. That's released from the anterior pituitary gland. It's going to influence our thyroid gland to produce thyroxine T3 and T4. So our next conversation is going to be on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So hypothalamus, below it, pituitary gland, infundibulum connects the two. In terms of the pituitary gland, you kind of have to remind yourself it's basically like having two glands attached to each other. Okay, so anterior pituitary gland is a little bit more complicated, while the posterior pituitary gland is a little more straightforward. It's basically a storage. So it's going to store the two hormones or store two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. It's ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So hypothalamus will produce it, while it's stored in the posterior pituitary gland and released from here. If you follow the neuron, it's going down here, and the axon terminals are here from where they are released. So be careful of questions. If they talk about produced by, you want to choose hypothalamus. If they're talking about stored and released from, then they're asking for posterior pituitary gland. So this is kind of straightforward. Oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone. And the anterior pituitary gland is a little more complicated. So hypothalamus will secrete hormones into the bloodstream. Blood will take it to the anterior pituitary gland and will either stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones. So let's talk about each of them. So GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. So this will stimulate the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. GHIH, growth hormone inhibitory hormone, which is mostly produced all the time in adults, unless we have acromegaly, for example, which will suppress the release of growth hormone. TRH, which is thyrotropic releasing hormone, will cause the release of TSH from anterior pituitary gland. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. CRH is corticotropic releasing hormone, which will cause the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, which we'll talk about all these hormones which the anterior pituitary gland in the next slide. Then GnRH is gonadotropic releasing hormone. This one causes the release of luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. And then our last one is prolactin inhibitory hormone, PIH, which is produced during most of our life, except in lactating mothers. It produces this normal physiology. That hormone is not released, and hence when this hormone is not released is when the anterior pituitary gland produces prolactin. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these hormones, the anterior pituitary hormones. So growth hormone will act on bones, muscles, which will, as the name suggests, and as you may be aware, it enhances growth of those structures and hence the whole body as a whole. TSH will stimulate our thyroid gland. It will cause the release of thyroxine T3, T4. Follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones have multiple functions. You'll talk about this in the reproductive system in the ANP2 part of this course. We're just going to cover the big picture here. Follicular stimulating hormone, you can think of it as producing the gametes in terms of ovum and sperm. Luteinizing hormone, you can think of it as the hormone that helps to produce the hormones produced by the gonads, whether it's testosterone by the testes or estrogen and progesterone by the ovaries. Prolactin, you may have guessed, it stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk, while the oxytocin will cause it to expel that milk, right? We didn't talk about antidiuretic hormone that causes, as the name may suggest to you, diuresis is urination, so it doesn't stop urination, but it decreases the volume of urination. It's trying to prevent water loss, so it reabsorbs most of the water in the urine, so kidneys will be the target for those. Oxytocin, another target, will also be the uterus during uterine contractions, especially during childbirth, but also happens during menses. Some individuals have strong pain during menses because of these uterine contractions. It's trying to expel its contents. It's also called a love hormone because there is some attachment associated with release of oxytocin when people spend time together. Then ACTH, adrenotropic hormone. This will cause the release of cortisol from adrenal cortex. Okay. So next we're going to talk about something called a hormonal cascade, where one hormone initiates the release of another second hormone, and this second hormone initiates the release of a third hormone. A good one to look at is our thyroid hormone. So TRH is released from the hypothalamus. TRH, or thyrotropic releasing hormone, will cause the anterior pituitary gland to release TSH, which in turn will cause our thyroid glands to release T3, T4. T3, T4 have the thyroid hormones control our basal metabolic rate. So when we are cold, for example, these will be released at a high amount to warm up our body, and then it also increases cellular metabolism, which in turn increases heat. So in terms of the cascades, normally they follow a negative feedback. So if we have, for example, body's heat is going up too much, one of the things it's going to try to cut down is the T3, T4. If it's trying to cut down the T3, T4, it'll tell the anterior pituitary gland to stop producing TSH. It also tells the hypothalamus to stop producing TRH. That way they're not being stimulated to be released. Next, we're going to talk about some disorders of the thyroid. Hypo means low. Hypothyroidism means little thyroid. So the hormones are not being produced. The symptoms are weight gain, lethargy, and cold intolerance. Even during summertime, these individuals can feel cold. Hyperthyroidism, now the basal metabolic rate is high in these patients due to increased thyroid hormones, right? So high temperatures common, sweating, weight loss, irritability, high blood pressure. They are always warm. They cannot cool down as well. Then we also have thyroid problems that can result due to some malnutrition. So in terms of history, about the 1930s in the US, there was a lot of hypothyroidism due to the lack of iodine in our diet. Okay, so what the FDA had recommended, you probably guessed now, is adding iodine to salt, table salt, right? So iodinized salt, you'll see. This is to prevent that. Okay, so basically, what is iodine? Why is it important in thyroid? If you did not know, the T3, T4, the 3 and 4 in those thyroxines, those hormones, is the number of iodine atoms present. Okay, so iodine is necessary for thyroid production. So if we have a low thyroid hormones, what is going to happen? The body is going to keep telling the anterior pituitary gland as well as the hypothalamus, we need more thyroxine, so the TRH and hence the TSH levels will go up. So they keep stimulating the thyroid gland. TSH will keep stimulating the thyroid gland. So it's like in a factory, when you have a lot of orders come in, you will try to build your capacity to make it, right? So what the thyroid does is it actually expands out. It becomes bigger, okay? But the problem is we still do not have the raw materials. They do not have the iodine to make the thyroid hormones. So they still suffer with low thyroxine, but they have a large enlarged thyroid gland. Okay. The next we're going to talk about some calcium, how hormones and our body reacts to changes in calcium levels. So first we're going to talk about when calcium is low in blood. So you can think of the blood as the wallet, so to speak, and the bone will be our bank. Okay. So when we have low calcium in blood, we will be withdrawing calcium from the bone. And how this is done is parathyroid hormone is released. That's going to stimulate, if you go back to the conversation, which cells of the bone. Hopefully you said osteoclast break down bone, osteoblast build up bone. So if we want to break down bone and release calcium, it's going to be osteoclast that are stimulated. So parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast, and parathyroid gland is found on the posterior surface. There's actually 4 of them found on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, 2 on either side. Okay, so they also will stimulate PTH, will also stimulate our kidneys to reabsorb the calcium, so we do not lose any calcium. It will also stimulate our digestive tract to absorb more calcium from the diet. Okay, so all in all, they'll try to increase blood calcium levels. We can do this for a little while, but we're going to run into trouble if we are doing this all the time, because you're going to break down bone a lot. So next we're going to talk about the opposite. If we consumed a lot of calcium, for example, our blood calcium levels will go up, and we want to now deposit it into the bank, right? So now it will not only stimulate, inhibit rather, should I say, of PTH being released, it will also stimulate another hormone being released. Very close, it's actually from the thyroid gland, okay? So let me let that sink in. It's also from the thyroid gland. It's calcitonin. In the thyroid gland, we have follicles. They look like little pools of fluid with some cells around it. That's going to do the main function of the thyroid gland, which is to produce thyroxine. But in between these pools, in between these follicles, we have cells. They're called parafollicular cells. Those will produce calcitonin when calcium levels in blood is high. Calcitonin has the opposite effect of PTH, so it will promote osteoblasts to deposit calcium into bone, as well as they don't really do anything much to the stomach and kidneys. To the stomach, they have nothing to action on the stomach. In the kidneys, they will just they will just instruct kidneys not to reabsorb calcium, to lose some of that calcium in urine. So calcitonin is produced when our blood calcium levels are low, hypocalcemia, and they are produced by parafollicular cells in the thyroid gland. Next, we're going to talk about the pancreas. Pancreas has many functions, exocrine as well as endocrine. The endocrine function, pancreas, most people have heard of insulin, but it also has another hormone, glucagon. So they work, they're antagonists to each other. Insulin is released after a meal, especially if it's carbohydrate-rich meal, because our glucose levels go up. It's trying to reduce the glucose in blood. Okay, what they do is they're going to promote absorption into the liver as well as skeletal muscles and their conversion to glycogen in the liver. Glucagon is released if we, for example, skip a meal. So if you did not have breakfast, there's going to be glucagon in your blood because blood glucose levels are dropping. Glucagon is going to stimulate our liver to release glucose into blood, so thereby raising the glucose back up to normal. These are both produced in the pancreas. The cells or group of cells are called islets of Langerhans. The alpha cells within these islets will produce glucagon, while the beta cells will produce the insulin. The last conversations about the adrenal gland. Adrenal medulla we mentioned in our autonomic nervous system conversation. It will produce epinephrine and norepinephrine when preganglionic sympathetic neurons stimulate them. The cells, hopefully you remember the name, was chromaffin cells. Okay, they will release that. Whereas the adrenal cortex releases other hormones. So we have aldosterone, which is called mineralocorticoids. It's a group of mineralocorticoids. Aldosterone basically controls salt in the blood, and hence water balance. While cortisol is the glucocorticoid group, it belongs to that. You might have heard of cortisol shots. They give that to reduce inflammation, but it's also a stress hormone. It's produced during stress levels, so it regulates our metabolism. It increases blood glucose level. During stress, we want glucose to be high so our body can process all these things that are happening. The adrenal cortex also produces testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, okay, in individuals that the gonads are not producing. So individuals who have testes, adrenal cortex is the place where we get estrogen and progesterone, where individuals who have ovaries, its testosterone is produced by the adrenal cortex again. Okay, I hope you found this video helpful. This is actually my last video for the series for ANP1. Um, um, so I hope you found all my videos helpful. Thank you again for listening and watching. Have a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of your class. Have a great day, everyone.